All right, my name is Kim Davenport. I'm the communications manager for Tacoma Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us for our March virtual program. I am delighted to have with me a wonderful guest who is going to talk to us about New Salishan. And the reason we're sharing this program this particular month is that next month, on April 2nd, we will be hosting our annual Destiny Dinner. This is an event we've not been able to hold for the past few years because of the pandemic, so we're very excited to gather again for a public event and welcome you to join us to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the redevelopment of Salishan. And so we wanted to share this conversation today with Michael Mirra, who just recently retired as the executive director of Tacoma Housing Authority and was intimately involved with that project. To share a little bit of the background and hopefully get you excited about coming out and helping us celebrate New Salishan in April. So welcome, Michael, and thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Kim, for inviting me.
So my first question for you is, can you take us back into the past and give us a little bit of history on why Salishan was developed in the first place, it originally developed, and when that took place?
Salishan's history really began with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. When that particular war for this country began, the federal government realized two things: that a lot of people were headed to the Pacific Northwest to build the ships and planes that won that war, and that when they got here, they would make a housing shortage a lot worse. In response, the federal government built Salishan to house war workers and their families. At the same time, it built other communities for the same purpose around Puget Sound area, all to house war workers. It was a federal government's emergency response to the war. And Tacoma Housing Authority had been formed a year previous. And its first big job was to manage Salishan for the federal government during the war. After the war, the federal government gave Salishan to the Tacoma Housing Authority for its use as public housing. The federal government did the same thing with the other communities around Puget Sound. And Salishan took its place as Tacoma's largest portfolio of affordable housing, as well as one of only a few neighborhoods in Tacoma that welcomed Black families. Tacoma Housing Authority then owned and managed Salishan from that time to the present. The housing at Salishan, though, was probably not meant to last as long as it did. Part of it was not built to be permanent housing. And by the 1990s, Salishan was worn out, partly because it wasn't meant to be permanent, and partly it's what you get when the federal government does not invest adequately in the capital needs of the public housing portfolio. And not only was the housing worn out, but the infrastructure was shot. It needed a new electrical distribution system, a new water distribution system, a new stormwater drainage system and sewer system. So it not only needed to be rebuilt, it needed to be dug up. And in the late 1990s, when this became clearer, Tacoma Housing Authority started to explore how to do that. And the development of New Salishan began in around 2002.
I had no idea, actually. It's interesting to hear you share that Tacoma Housing Authority dates back that far as an entity. I didn't realize that it was coinciding with the original building of Salishan. So that's fascinating history.
Yeah, the Tacoma City Council called THA into being in 1940.
It's fascinating to know that history. So you've hinted at this already, but how did Salishan change over the many decades between the war when it was built and, around the time when the decision was made to do the redevelopment? What are some of the ways in which it changed, in addition to falling into disrepair, but what are some other ways that change happened?
Probably by the 1980s, it was afflicted with a lot of difficulties that were common to some urban neighborhoods. Notable amount of crime, disinvestment. It certainly experienced the disinvestment the East Side experienced in general. And it was not very attractive. The housing, when it was built fast for a particular purpose. So it needed a thorough redo. And one option might have been to try to keep up and repair it thoroughly. But like an old car, at some point, it's not worth the repair.
Right. So jumping forward to 2002, when this decision is made to go forward with the redevelopment process, what were some of the specific challenges that presented themselves? I can imagine cost is a challenge and just the enormity of the project, but what specific challenges were faced?
The main challenge arose from Tacoma Housing Authority's ambitions for the redevelopment. Tacoma Housing Authority is not a large housing authority by some measure. This was a large project by any measure. It was going to completely redevelop 200 urban acres in the largest redevelopment in the history of the city, the largest of its kind west of the Mississippi River. And it became the preoccupation for the Tacoma Housing Authority really for the next 15 years. And getting it done took everything THA had. It took our bonding capacity, our credit limits. It took the full-throated support of the community. And there are people at THA who threw their hearts, lives, and marriages into building New Salishan. And our ambitions for it then were front and center to answer your question. The first challenge was its scale. It turned into a $300 million redo. So the first challenge was finding that money. And most of the money was from private sources. Important sources from the federal government, the city, the county, and the state, but most of it was private. Commercial debt and tax credit investor equity. The next challenge was the design of Salishan. We had ambitions for the design. Our main design ambition is that it look lovely. And then we had ambitions that grew out of our growing understanding of how do you do real estate development to serve social justice goals. And Salishan taught us a lot about how to do
that. I so want to know more about that in particular, but I'll come back to more questions about that as we go. You've already hinted at the key that, initially Salishan was one of the few neighborhoods welcoming to Black families at its birth. So it doesn't surprise me that concerns of that nature are fundamental to what you're looking at in this project. I'm curious, as decisions were being made in this redevelopment process, what were some of the things that set this apart from maybe other similar projects around the country? I'm imagining from what you said earlier that there were other aging neighborhoods around the country that maybe other entities are working on redeveloping. What was distinct about decisions made for Salishan?
You're right, Kim, that other communities around the country were tearing down their public housing communities because they too were worn out. Salishan was distinctive in a way that while other communities were decreasing the amount of affordable housing on site and reducing density. Salishan, in its redevelopment, was increasing the number of housing and increasing the density. Now, part of that was just a difference in land use, in contrast to larger cities back east, which built high rises. Salishan's initial design from the 1940s was more suburban, and it was not a good use of urban land. So we had more room to fit more housing in, and we took advantage of it. And probably 20 years from now, present Salishan will be counted as that it needs to be even more dense than it is. But we increased density, and that was a distinguishing feature from other redevelopments around the country. Another, what I think to be distinguishing about Salishan was the work we put in to knit it into the community in ways that we can talk about if you wish, but Salishan tried to be an asset for the entire East Side in not only the housing it provided, but the community spaces, both indoor and outdoor, and the community services. And then we spent a lot of time thinking about not only what we were building and why, but how we got it done, and to do it in a way that made Tacoma stronger. You might have heard this understanding about spending $1 twice. You spend $1 the first time for the services and materials it gives you. And then, Kim, you spend it, you get the value of the $1 a second time in how you spend it to make Tacoma stronger. And we had 3 spending goals. One goal is we wanted as much as possible for the contracting dollars to go to firms owned by persons of color and women. And we had a goal that 22% of the dollars would go to those firms. And we came out with 35%. Our second spending goal was that as much as possible, we wanted the jobs created by the construction to go to people who lived or who used to live at Salishan, who lived at some of THA's other communities or participated in THA's other housing programs or other low-income households in Tacoma. We wanted 50% of the jobs to go to people in those groups, and we came in at 90%. Our third spending goal was to spend locally. And we ended up spending 37% of the dollars in Tacoma, 46% in Pierce County, including Tacoma, and 99% somewhere else in Washington State. The 1% were probably our lawyers from Baltimore. But this was important to us. This was a way to do real estate development to count not only as an investment in what we were building, but how we got it built. Those numbers are a credit to Walsh Construction, our general contractor, who I count to be just largely responsible for those successes. And we were so lucky with that partnership.
So we know that prior to the redevelopment, Salishan was one of the most racially diverse neighborhoods in Tacoma. And I'm curious if that has remained the case, if that's still the case after the redevelopment.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think the answer starts with what Salishan was like during World War II. The federal government built this community to house war workers. As it built other communities around the Northwest, it built Hanford to build the atomic bomb. It built Oak Ridge in Tennessee to build the atomic bomb. It built the communities along the Columbia to build the dams. And it built Salishan. And of them all, as I understand, Salishan was the only one that was racially integrated on purpose. I don't know why that is, but it stands out in that way. And it had that feature from its start, and it has remained its signature since. It was one of the few neighborhoods after the war that welcomed Black families. And then after the fall of Saigon, Salishan became a gateway community offering the first home to new Americans from Vietnam, and then Cambodia, and then a wave of newcomers from Eastern Europe, Russian and Ukrainian. And when we tore Salishan down to rebuild it, it was probably about 25% African-American, about maybe a third Asian, maybe 10% from Latin America, another maybe 10 or 15% from Europe, and miscellaneous other backgrounds. And it was important to us that we preserve that diversity when we rebuilt Salishan, but with an important added development. New Salishan, in contrast with old Salishan, Kim, was going to be a mix of homeowners and renters. We knew our renters would be very racially diverse in the way I just described, because we know our renters. We also knew that in a community like that, the main tension would be between the homeowners and the renters. We were told to expect that because we consulted nationally. And we didn't want that line to also be a racial line. So we worked really hard for a pool of home purchasers with a diversity to match the diversity we knew we would have in our renters. And we were largely successful. And New Salishan is, in its renter population, about what I just described to you. And interestingly, Kim, the homeowners are Pierce County's most diverse population of homeowners. So, for instance, Pierce County, the numbers I remember, about 8% of Pierce County's homeowners are Black or African American. In Salishan, about 16% of the homeowners are Black or African American. In Pierce County, about 7% of homeowners are Asian. In Salishan, about 25% of them are Asian. And similar contrasts with other groups. This is why Salishan won the Housing Justice Award from the Fair Housing Center. And we are enormously pleased about that success. And I think that accounts largely for Salishan's ability to knit back together as a neighborhood. There are still those tensions, but I don't understand them to be racial. And I count that to be a notable victory.
That is most definitely a notable victory. And especially from the perspective of thinking about Tacoma history. And, we frequently have shared stories having to do with redlining or other, such practices. It's really a wonderful story that we should continue to celebrate about Salishan.
You're right to fit it into the city's larger history. And as with all cities in the country, there is a intentional racial segregation. So there's not only a lot of work to do, there's a lot of work to undo. And undoing looks like Salishan.
It's a wonderful way to put it. Thank you. Kind of along similar lines to what you were just talking about knitting back together a community and not altering it too dramatically. So when a neighborhood is torn down and rebuilt, obviously people are displaced by that. So how was that handled? You went into it knowing people would be displaced, but also knowing hopefully some of those same people would want to come back. How was that handled in this process?
It's a very important question. And we uprooted 855 families. all of them low income, many of them quite vulnerable. How do you do that? And the first part of the answer is with extensive communication that starts years in advance about why this is happening. Lots of community meetings in multiple languages. And Tacoma Housing Authority also had very important legal obligations to handle that relocation in a way that ensured that relocating families were landing in a place that didn't cost them any more in rent than Salishan cost them, that met their individualized needs, and that gave them a right to return if they wanted. Getting this done was its own project. And it's one of those projects which cannot be done wholesale. It's got to be done family by family. And THA had a wonderful group of relocation specialists that counseled with every family individually in their language to understand what they wanted, what they needed. One of the first questions, for example, is, so do you want to move back to Salishan when it's done, or do you want to move out and not come back? And I think we ended up about half of the people said they wanted to move back and half said they didn't plan on moving back. But we let people change their mind. And about half the people moved back, but it wasn't the same half that said they wanted to move back. Because when you move out, even though you thought you want to come back, your life changes and you settle in someplace else. Or you moved out not saying you wanted to come back, but when you saw how good New Salishan looked, you changed your mind. This is also where you learn if you move too fast. Because if you don't listen carefully enough, if you rush and you don't understand what a family needs, the family can dig in and not move out and force you to eviction. And THA relocated 855 families without a single eviction. This was a credit to the customer service skills, the listening skills, the patience, and the dedication of THA staff. But you're right to ask about relocation, Kim, because the urban renewal in this country of low income, especially neighborhoods of color, has a deplorable record of not listening, moving too fast, not caring about where people land. And we were determined not to add to that history.
Again, something Tacoma should definitely celebrate. That's a serious accomplishment. Again, I have another question kind of along this same theme. We'll move on to some other things in a few minutes, but can you demonstrate after this project is done and after New Salishan is open that there is a comparable amount of affordable housing to what was available before? Was that accomplished as one of the goals?
Yes. There are two main ways to measure the amount of affordable housing. And Salishan increased the amount by either measure. One way is you count doorknobs. And how many, we started with 855, and so count how many you ended up with. And I think we ended up with about 870 affordable units, affordable to families down to zero income. Plus, of the 350 or so homes for sale, a full 1/4 of them were reserved for low-income households. So that added another 90 or so. There's another way you can measure the amount of affordable housing, and that's the concept of unit years. So let's say you have an affordable unit that has 5 years left to its lifespan before it needs a big fix-up. That would be 5 unit years. Salishan had 855 units that probably should have been torn down 10 years previous. So it had essentially 0 unit years. And we tore them all down and put back 870 rental units, each of them with 30 unit years to them. So we increased the amount of affordable housing by that measure by many times over. So we count Salishan as a success by both measures. And the affordability of the units is one dimension of what we put back, but there are other features to those units that are worth some mention. So for example, Arlington Drive campus for homeless youth and young adults on the north end of Salishan has 60 units reserved for homeless young adults. Just as affordable, but for a specialized population that needs them. Plus a 12-unit crisis residential center for homeless 12 to 17-year-olds, homeless without families. And while you can count them as doorknobs, they have that added dimension that's worth noting.
Absolutely. So I know that another of the improvements to this concept of this community, beyond simply tearing down these houses that were past their usage and been building new buildings, is also having more services available within walking distance in this community. Can you talk about why that's so important? I think I would say for any community to have services within walking distance, but specifically for a low-income community to have that resource.
You're right. Every community needs necessary services, preferably close enough so you can get there without a car, without a bus, because much of community orbits around those services. And we were intent on Salishan having those services for that purpose. I'll mention that much of this effort was trying to recapture what Salishan had during World War II. During World War II, Salishan, a community of war workers, had childcare, a community center, a movie theater, some retail, and meeting spots that helped it cohere as a community. And after World War II, Salishan lost much of that. Redeveloping it was an effort to recapture it. We had some advantages in doing it, and these are the services that we were able to arrange at Salishan. At the top of the list is probably Lister Elementary School. And the Tacoma Public School District just has been an essential, wonderful partner. And they built Lister, new Lister. They built the First Creek Middle School on Salishan's southern border. So you can, if you're a child, you can walk to school from kindergarten through middle school. And in fact, Blick's Elementary School and Roosevelt Elementary School are themselves a couple blocks away. Community Health Care built the Kimmy and Dr. George Tambera Medical and Dental Clinic right in the middle of Salishan, dedicated to the proposition that your zip code should not determine either your lifespan or your health span. Metro Parks built Eastside Community Center right next to First Creek Middle School. Just a very impressive and fancy and elaborate collection of athletic and community services. The Metro Parks also owns Swan Creek Park, which is a 370-acre park that wraps Salishan. It's an urban jewel, and it's in walking distance. And then Tacoma Housing Authority hosts its own services at the Family Investment Center, right in the middle of Salishan. We were hoping for a grocery store in the middle of Salishan, and we tried hard to elicit interest from the grocery store world, but we were not successful, but perhaps later.
It's an impressive array of wonderful facilities. It really is. And speaking as someone who lives not far from Salishan, when I discovered Swan Creek Park, I was in awe. I thought I was already in awe of things like Point Defiance, but Tacoma has a really amazing array of parks, and to have that resource as part of this community is really phenomenal.
Kim, in your walk through Swan Creek,
yes,
did you come across that forested area on the south end of Salishan, where the street grid, it's a strange landscape. The street grid is in place with all these very mature trees that are grown up. That street grid used to be part of Salishan, but the federal government gave that part to Metro Parks to take its place as part of Swan Creek, not Salishan. But it's an interesting landscape with these very mature trees growing up among these streets.
It is. I was wondering what the history of that was when I walked through there, because it's fascinating to see that all of a sudden, because much of as you park your car and walk through New Salishan, everything looks newer, newer sidewalks and younger planted trees and things like that. And then there's this old growth, essentially. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and we count Metro Parks as another wonderful partner. And we are each other's largest neighbors, and it's a very good fit of competencies and values.
Yes. So I've asked you about several things, and just for the sake of time, I'm limiting my questions. I have many more things I might want to ask you about, but let me turn that over to you. Is there something in particular that I haven't asked about that that you think is particularly important to highlight as being unique, special about New Salishan?
Well, I would count, it's now 20 years old, so it's a time to take stock on whether it all worked or not. And these are some of the important measures that I think show it to have worked quite well. First of all, it is providing incredibly necessary and valuable housing of high quality and affordability. It has done that in a community that, as we just discussed, has a lot of social and commercial amenities. It is financially sustainable. That's important. It has, I think, successfully integrated homeownership with rental in ways that you don't see too much in the market. And one of our other goals is that it look lovely, and I think it does. I'll mention a final goal, which I think is showing quite promising results. Salishan, Kim, is integrated by factors that in other parts of the market are segregating factors. At Salishan, they are integrating factors. Homeowner rental, race, language, ethnicity, national origin, age, ability, and disability. And the challenge of Salishan is the nation's challenge, which is to help people live across those lines. And it seems to be working pretty well at Salishan.
Thank you. That's really outstanding, as something that Tacoma can hold up as an accomplishment. These are really pressing issues for every community in the nation.
Yeah. And, you know, the market is pretty thoroughly segregated by income, homeowner and renter, and it takes an effort of imagination to imagine otherwise, and Salishan can help us do it.
So you're no longer in the position of leading THA. Congratulations on retiring. You've obviously put in plenty of important effort over many years, but I'm sure you still think about these questions. What do you think are some lessons learned from the redevelopment of Salishan that can be applied to future projects?
That the work it takes and the investment required pays for itself in all sorts of important community metrics of well-being and finances. For example, at Salishan, generations of children are growing up in families that are stable, with housing that is high quality, comfortable, and secure. And that has enormous payoffs for those children down the road. Salishan brought onto the tax rolls of the city about 350 homeowners who, in the time since those homes were bought in property taxes, have repaid to the city, the county, and the state their investment in building Salishan. And I also think that Salishan offers, by example, the benefits of building lovely. At THA, we tell ourselves that both ugly and lovely are contagious. And if you build something lovely, I think it makes it more likely that other developers will at least give design some thought.
I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question, but I'm really enjoying this phrase about building lovely, and so I wanted to ask, what does that mean? What does that include? I mean, I can imagine things come to mind like landscaping and you know, varieties of architecture, but what does that mean for THA, or what does that mean for you?
It meant designing it on a scale that felt humane, especially for children. Salishan is designed for children and walkers. It meant building it in a way so that the people lived there felt that it looked lovely. It meant planting a lot of trees. And by the way, my mention of trees makes me tell you that another of our development goals was to build Salishan in a way that was environmentally responsible. And that meant several things. First, Salishan earned a designation of LEED Platinum, which is a measure of how green the product is and the method to get it built. And Salishan's third phase got LEED Platinum, which was the largest designation of platinum in the country at the time. Salishan also was innovative in its stormwater drainage system. It does not have a normal stormwater drainage system. In fact, it's designed to keep water out of the city's stormwater drainage system, so it doesn't get to Puget Sound. And you might know that Puget Sound is one of the environmental challenges. In some ways, it's a dying inland sea. And the main problem is agricultural and urban runoff. And Salishan is designed to keep 91% of the rainwater that falls on it on site, soaking into the ground, so it never gets to Puget Sound. And we count that as part of the noble lessons that you can build in a way that has that measure of environmental responsibility and still be financially sustainable.
So this leads to, I feel like a final question that I feel that you've already answered, but I want to give you a chance to present it again anyway, because I think it's a really impressive accomplishment that we see. I think it's something that Tacoma should celebrate, that people who live in Tacoma who haven't been to New Salishan should visit and walk the lovely streets and experience that community. So we are now celebrating the 20th anniversary of the beginning of this project. And you have mentioned many goals that were set out for that project and what the challenges were. What data do we now have at 20 years that we can point to and say, yes, this was a success. We've met these goals. And I know you've already mentioned some of those, but any others you'd like to highlight?
Well, you can count doorknobs if you're wondering whether it's an increase in the amount of housing. You can count unit years. You can count a long waiting list of people who want to live there. The increasing value of the home ownership units, that is a measure of success as a purchase market. The number of just very strong community partners who made their own investment into Salishan. I've listed some of them: the school district, Metro Parks, community health care, Korean Women's Association, Human Good. Those are all good. Those investments are very good measures of community confidence in Salishan. And then Salishan is cash flowing. And that's important for its future health. And then you walk through Salishan, and without counting anything, you can make a judgment for yourself on how you think it's doing by how it looks and feels. And when I walk through Salishan, I think it looks and feels good.
I would agree. I completely agree. And it's I've lived in Tacoma long enough to remember the old Salishan, and it was not a neighborhood that you would choose to go walk through. There were no trees, and the houses were falling down, and it was not a good community, either for itself or contributing to larger Tacoma. And now New Salishan is that. It is a solid, healthy community that does contribute to the city as a whole. I'm really hoping that our conversation will inspire people to want to come out and come to the Eastside Community Center. You mentioned that earlier, where we will be holding our Destiny Dinner this year, and to celebrate New Salishan, to celebrate this 20th anniversary. I know I'm excited to be there. I'm excited to keep learning more. And I just really, really appreciate everything you've shared with us today.
You're most welcome, Kim. I'm grateful for your interest.
Thank you.